Hey YouTube, it's Gabe here from the Spine Crackers podcast, and I'm going to be doing a top 5 to be read list for you today. I have a couple caveats before I get started. The first one is that this is a personal TBR list. I don't speak for the podcast, the three-headed monster that is the Spine Crackers podcast. These are 5 books that I want to read in the broadly construed, relatively near future. There may be books that strike my immediate fancy more than one of these sometime soon that I read before I read any of these. And I may just simply not have time to read some of them. Some of these are some thick boys, as you'll see. And I may opt to read other books instead. So this is a personal list. It's not definitive. These lists are constantly changing. If I made this exact same video probably in a month, it might look different, even if I have not read any of these books yet. So that's caveat number 1. Caveat number 2 is that, of course, there are dozens, hundreds, potentially thousands of books that might belong on this list in a more objective sense. I don't particularly like that term in the context of thinking about what we're, literature and what we read and ranking things like that and so on. But there are plenty of books out there that I probably should have read that I haven't. I've never read, The Recognitions, to pick a au courant text. I've never read Blood Meridian, which some of you might balk at, given what I'm about to say in a few minutes. Things like that. There are books out there that I probably objectively should read before I read some of these books. But I don't really care, and I probably won't. Some of those books I want to read, some of them I don't really care about reading that much. So this is a personal list. This is a list of books, wow, that I want to read in this current moment. This is a snapshot in time, and hopefully it'll give you a bit of a sense of where I'm at currently with what I'm reading, and a sense of sort of what my general tastes are, some of my predilections, things like that. And yeah, that's it. Those are my 2 caveats. So, the other thing that I guess I'll say, maybe this is the third caveat, is that I could have made a list that it was just a bunch of those, books that I should read that I haven't read. I don't see that as the purpose of these videos. I really dislike when I click on a video that says, my top 5 TBR, and it's just 5 good books that they haven't read. Okay, well, great. We all know what the good books are. We all know what the ones you're supposed to read are. If you haven't read them, that's fine. I don't know. Doesn't make for a particularly interesting video to me. So here are my top 5 books that I want to read. Number 1, Georges Simenon's Pedigree. Georges Simenon is my favorite author. He is a Belgian writer known mostly for his detective novels featuring Inspector Maigret. Forgive my French. I'm just kind of goofing and going to do some overly dramatic pronunciations because I think it's fun. He's known for his detective novels and for his roman d'or, which are a little bit sort of more darker noir, more hard-boiled. I would argue that his detective novels featuring Maigret are already pretty dark and existentialist and depressing. I've read dozens of Simenon's works, which in the context of Simenon is actually not many, given that he wrote hundreds of books. I think almost 200 novels, maybe even more. And I love everything that I've read of his. I could talk about Simenon for hours, but the reason that I specifically want to read this book is because this is the one that took him the longest to write, as far as I understand it, which is interesting because obviously if he's pumping out that many books, he would sit down and he would write a Maigret novel in a week or 2 weeks. And he would write in these sort of fits of self-induced sort of, meditation or ecstasy or whatever you want to call it. And this one took a bit longer, and sat on the shelf a bit longer than most of his other books. It started out as an autobiography because Simenon had a concerning visit to a doctor that made him worried for his health, and he wanted to leave a document of his own life in Belgium as a child for his son. And He showed the manuscript to Andre Gide, who convinced him to turn it into a novel. So Simenon shifted it to the third person, added a few more narrative literary elements, as far as I understand it, and then we have Pedigree. It's a novel about which Simenon himself said, everything is true, but nothing is accurate. And I think that's just such a fascinating, interesting statement on biography in general and autobiography, perhaps specifically. Um, and it's a very Simenon sort of turn of phrase. So Pedigree by George Simenon is number one on the list. Number two on the list is Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana. This is a short book. It's about 200 pages, and it's about a guy who I think is an ex-vacuum salesman who's recruited by MI6, the British intelligence agency, to be a spy in Cuba in the 50s. And I'm interested in reading this book. I like Graham Greene quite a bit. This is a bit of a cheat because we will be reading another Graham Greene novel on the podcast in a few months. But it's, I won't say what it is, but I've read a few other Graham Greene novels. I've read The Power and the Glory and one or two of his other shorter novels. But I want to read this one, and I really like Greene's perspective. One of my kind of pet literary interests is colonial and post-colonial and decolonial literature. Literature in and about and sort of dealing with the phenomenon of Western colonialism. We'll talk more about that later. And I think Graham Greene has a really sort of funny and melancholy and sad and very human take on the failure of the West to engage with other cultures in a way that is meaningful. Obviously, sort of anytime you're reading colonial era literature, you have to be mindful about who it is that you're reading. Are you reading the colonizer or the colonized, right? I'm going to be doing another one of these videos, these TBR videos for the Patreon, which will be linked in the description, about my top 5 nonfiction TBR. And on that list, you'll see a few decolonial, post-colonial texts, because again, this is just sort of an era of history that I'm deeply interested in, because I feel like it has shaped so much of the world that we live in now, from our economic ideologies to our racial ideologies, our sense of identity when we talk about things like the West. I think this is really, like, in order to understand where we are now, I feel like understanding the colonial era is the bare minimum, I think, of where you need to start. And so much great literature came out of it. I have another book that I grabbed here. This is not not officially on the TBR list, but it's a collection. It's called Empire Writing, and it's a collection of texts edited by Elike Bomer. Bomer, I'm sorry. And it's a collection of texts in and around and about British and Western European colonial expansion. And it's a fascinating and depressing and infuriating reading through these texts from that era and the ideologies represented and the struggles of the people who were living under colonial rule, and all of that is represented really well in this collection. So I highly recommend this if you're interested in that era or literature or art from that period of time. Anyway, Graham Greene, I think, is a chronicler of that mentality and sort of its aftermath in the Western psyche that I think is really worth engaging with. And this book, Our Man in Havana, doesn't take place in that era, the sort of high heyday of Western colonial expansion. But I think it is from what I understand of it, a funny sort of satirical send up of some of the mentalities and some of the orientations at play in those relationships. So Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana, number 2. Number 3, another vaguely colonial era or post-colonial era text, Richard Hughes's A High Wind in Jamaica. This is a book that has sort of bullied its way onto this list. I've had this physical copy of this book for years, probably a decade, maybe more. And I always sort of see it sitting on my shelf, and it has a very attractive kind of color scheme, this yellow and green and purple. The cover is a section of a painting by outsider artist Henry Darger. There's a fantastic documentary about him you ought to watch. It's called In the Realms of the Unreal. And I've always sort of meant to pick this up in my various sort of moments of free time, or wanting to read a new book, and for whatever reason I never have. So I'm going on video now, committing to reading this book relatively soon. It's about a group of children in Jamaica who end up on a pirate ship, basically, with a group of pirates. The back of the book says the dreamlike action of this masterpiece of concentrated narrative begins among the decayed plantation houses and overwhelming natural abundance of late 19th century Jamaica. It then moves on to the high seas as Richard Hughes tells the story of a group of children accidentally thrown upon the mercy of a crew of down-at-the-heel pirates. A tale of seduction and betrayal, of accommodation and manipulation, of weird humor and unforeseen violence, this classic of 20th century literature is an unequaled exploration of the nature and limits of innocence. It just sounds fascinating to me. I don't know much about Richard Hughes. I think he only wrote like 3 or 4 novels. I know he wrote some poetry as well. His mother, I believe, spent her childhood in the British West Indies, and so he has some personal connection and experience with that part of the world during the high colonial era. And so this is another one of those texts that sort of fits into that general preoccupation that I have, and it just seems funny and really interesting. So Richard Hughes's A High Wind in Jamaica is number 3 on the list. By the way, this is the New York Review of Books edition, as was the Simenon. These, I don't know if New York Review of Books is publishing Simenon anymore. I think Penguin kind of took that over because they are the ones publishing all of his Maigret novels. I'm not sure what happened to the rights to his other works, but I know some of the NYRB editions of Simenon have gone out of print. And then the Graham Greene is obviously Penguin as well. Number 4 on the list, speaking of interesting covers, is Michael Cisco's Animal Money. This is a thick boy. It's a fatty. I think it's about 800 pages. And Michael Cisco is a writer who is associated, sometimes against his will, it seems to me. He I think, personally is not, or resists putting his work in genre groupings, but he's associated with the sort of new weird fiction, your Jeff Vandermeers, your China Miévilles, and people like that. And we actually did an episode of the Spinecrackers podcast on his first novel, The Divinity Student, months back, and we all quite enjoyed it. And I had actually wanted to read Cisco because of this book. I had found this book, but it's obviously a little large to do, for a weekly podcast, although we may, who knows, down the road. We've done some Fat Boys since then. But I think Cisco is up to something really interesting. I like what he did in The Divinity Student quite a bit, and I've been wanting to read more of his work. And this is the one that really got me interested in reading him in the first place. And so I want to revisit it, or I guess visit it for the first time. I don't know a ton about the book other than the sort of basic premise, which is that it takes place in a world where animals are used as currency. That's basically all I know. But how can I say no to a cover like that? I mean, look at this. This is a gorgeous book, a gorgeous edition. It's published, I think, by, sadly, a press that I believe is defunct. If I'm wrong about that, please correct me, but it's published by Lazy Fascist Press. So I'm not sure what the fate of this edition of the book is, but it's one of the most sort of enticing physical books that I own. So Michael Cisco's Animal Money, number 4. There we go, for the thumbnail. Number 5 is, and this is another bit of a cheat because this is standing in for a trilogy of novels. This is A.B. Guthrie's Fairland, Fairland. This is the third in a trilogy of novels that starts with The Big Sky and The Way West. So if I'm a sucker for colonial era literature, I am equally, if not more so, a sucker for literature about the American West and westward expansion, which is, of course, in and of itself, a type of colonial literature. Um, and I don't just mean sort of the good stuff. I know, a lot of people like westerns, but they only mean, the elevated westerns, your John Fords, your Sergio Leones, and so on. Uh, your Blood Meridians, whatever, that sort of thing. I like that. I like all that just fine. Although I've never read Blood Meridian, as I've said. Um, I really like the pulpy stuff. I like the Zane Greys. I like the Clarence Mulfords. I like the Owen Wisters. I like the 50-cent mass market paperbacks, some of which are worth a lot of money these days. I really like the low to the ground iconography and mythology of the American West. I lived for a time in West Texas, and I fell in love with some of the some nonfiction Texas writers, your John Graves, J. Frank Dobie, people like that who wrote about sort of cattle ranching and the people who were concerned about the land and the space of the American West. And it's not born necessarily out of a romantic or idealized vision of the place, although I confess that in living out there, where I was living at the time was, I think, in the United, I believe this is true, I'll have to double check, but the flattest place in the United States in terms of the number of degrees from horizon to horizon. And there is something about those spaces. I don't have much else to say about it, but there's something about it. But my interest really derives from the fact that I think the era of westward expansion and the fascination with the American West in the popular imaginary has, in a similar way to what the era of colonial expansion, Western European colonial expansion, has done for our understandings of the West and certain sorts of economic relations and cultural practices. American westward expansion is the era that, for me, in my opinion, really defined the country, really defines America and what it means to be an American as an identity. And that runs the gamut from things like certain traits about masculinity, certain sort of economic traits of sort of rugged individualism and self-reliance. Of course, that's a text from much earlier, but I think Emerson meant it a bit differently than the Cowboys did. But anyway, I think that the era of American westward expansion is pivotal in understanding how it is that we got to where we are currently as a country, as this concept that is America, and as this identity that is the American identity. And so I love reading popular depictions and sort of conceptualizations of the West as a concept. And I just think it's a beautiful part of the country, and I love being there. So that might be a tension, right? That I have this view of this of Western depictions of the West and things like that as certainly kind of problematic and arguably harmful in terms of what it has wrought with respect to our country and our national identity, and certainly just in terms of the raw harm that it caused to native populations and things like that. And yet I maintain a fascination with the era and with literature from the era. So A.B. Guthrie's Fairland, and The Big Sky and the Way West, that trilogy is on my to be read list. So those are the 5 books I want to read, or 5 of the books I want to read that I decided to include in this video. If you liked it, leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, go listen to the podcast. If you really, really liked it, go subscribe to the Patreon. There's a lot of cool stuff over there. We're going to be doing more and more Patreon exclusive content soon. Um, and leave a comment if any of these books are interesting to you, if you've read any of them, if there are ones you want to recommend based on what you saw that you think I might like. I would really appreciate that. And have a great day. I appreciate you watching. Thanks.